All right, good people. Welcome back to another day in the life of a practical web developer. I'm your host of this wonderful show, Cam Flowers, aka Professor Cam, aka Professor, aka that dude that's wearing a hoodie right now. So last time we got together, we started talking about connecting HTML and CSS. Clearly, building web pages is way more than just thinking about the structure of those web pages, right? We started getting into a little bit more talking about the design and how, in order to create a meaningful website, the structure is important for sure. But after you structure it, there's so many opportunities for you to think about, like, how are you going to style this to communicate that structure visually for people who are going to go to your site? So HTML is the structure of web pages. CSS is how we start to style them and give that structure a more visual layout for users. So we're going to continue on to the process of building out this application. We started building out a tic-tac-toe game. So I'm going to just go ahead and pull it up real quick. So first, I'm just going to share my screen so y'all can see what I'm doing here. And we started this project in VS Code. Here's the code right here. It is not doing too much. We have an index.html file that we started. And in that index.html file, we have the most important elements of HTML. So I'm going to, I showed it to you right now, but I'm going to go away from it for a second, and just for yourself, right? Drop in the chat, what are 4 things that you know every HTML page is going to contain? Just drop it in the chat for me real quick, you know, little check for understanding, if you will. Also making sure you're awake, you know, like making sure you didn't just hear me start talking and now, you know, nobody's listening no more. See some people drop it in the chat. Appreciate that. So what are some different things that you know an HTML page is gonna have? 4 different things that you know that it's gonna have. Dope. Seeing a lot of different stuff. Declaration, definitely, right? That's this wonderful thing here at the top. The HTML tag, yep. And the HTML tag kind of encapsulates all of the different tags and elements that we're going to put into our document. The body, somebody said, right? The body is the tag responsible for creating the element in our HTML that is holds all of our visual content, right? And the head, right? So the head is the element responsible for containing all of the elements that are holding the metadata for the web page. Great, great, great. So before I open up this head right quick, one more question for y'all. What are some of the different types of metadata that you remember that we can add in the head, right? Some people were asking that last time we were here on the stream, like, what are different types of metadata that might be there? Seeing a lot of different stuff in the chat. Some folks said the title. Yep, exactly, right? So the title might be an important piece of metadata that you'd have in your web page. The title is the element that allows for you to change the, represent the name of your document on like a tab, for instance. So people will know, okay, cool, this is what this web page is doing. Great, great. Some folks said things like the style sheet, which are the link to the style sheet, right? And links to different files. And definitely, right? So we see that on line 16 here. We have a link to our CSS style sheet right there as well. And that is helping us create the structure that we need for the site generally, the style for our site. That link is what actually connects our CSS hosted at this link, or this URL, excuse me, to connect to our HTML document more specifically. And then other things about like the character set, things about our description and other elements that allow for the site to have descriptive data about itself that search engines might care about, might be important to connect your page to different files, etc. So great, good job, good job, good job. Cool. Last question. This is like a 3-question pop quiz, funny enough. What do y'all remember about divs that we talked about last session, right? There was a couple of different things I was talking about with a div element. And I'm curious what you all remember about what a div might be. Cool. Somebody said a container, right? And definitely love that. I think that's the best way to think about it, right? So there's times HTML is all about nested elements, right? And so we can see that from just the logical structure of HTML that we talked about here. But one of the things that's really interesting is we have an element in HTML called a div that really is used to be a container of sorts. We put items inside of divs often, and the div represents, basically it's an element that holds any other elements inside of it, right? So what makes divs special is just that you can use them as wrappers over other elements. And the cool thing about this is really kind of, not only does it help to organize code with wrappers, you'll find it's easier to organize things in that regard. But when you do this, you can also style those containers in a more targeted way. So we'll talk a little bit more about that today. We'll see in some more of this conversation about HTML and CSS, but div is a really important element. It's just really helpful to know. Cool. And yeah, so oh, one more wonderfully important question. What do y'all remember these things are called, right? So we have this element like link, right? And here we have href and rel, and in the meta we have name and content. What are those things called? Do y'all remember? Drop the name in the chat. Yeah, shout out Leah. An attribute, definitely. Exactly. So HTML allows for us to create attributes, and sometimes these attributes are required of us in our elements. So depending on the element you're creating, it's important to look up what might be its attributes, especially if the element requires certain pieces of data to function, right? So a good example of a piece of element that requires specific data to function would be like a link, right? In order for this link element to show up, we need to pass it something to link to, and that's why this href attribute becomes very important, right? You might be wondering, well, what is the difference between like an attribute and the way that we send data here, right? Like for the H1, right? We need data for the tic-tac-toe, but I guess the difference is that you could technically have a blank H1 that has no information, and it would still be logical HTML here. Whereas with this link, it's impossible for us to even put a link element up without it having a place to link to. I know that kind of feels like a cop-out answer, even in my own head. But another big difference here is in the fact that text is considered HTML. So it's interesting to think about what's actually happening with this heading is that it's not just like, oh, the heading is this H1 and the text in this. This is actually wrapping the text, which is in and of itself considered HTML as well. So the heading is almost like wrapping the thing that it is making the heading, which turns out that text is considered HTML in that regard too. Whereas this link reference, this URL isn't HTML. We can't represent that in HTML. It just is the data we need to pass, which is why it's stored in an attribute versus it being kind of like embodied in this like nested wrapping scenario here. But yeah, so this is kind of where we're at with our HTML. Last time we were chatting. Michael, go ahead, fam.
Oh, all right. So just a quick question. So up here, you said that like this internal text is also an element as well. So does that internal text, does it what's the word I'm looking? Does it inherit the attributes of the encapsulating element? Hey, why can't I hear?
That's interesting. You're saying that you're wondering like, right, like or I guess like, let's look at this H1, right?
Yeah, H1.
Does this text inherit the attributes passed here inside of the H1? Yeah. That's a good question. And I think that in certain regards, yes. Like, so for instance, if we tried one of the attributes that we can use in HTML for its elements is actually, funny enough, a style attribute. And the style attribute actually corresponds to the CSS that we would want to pass into an element. So in this regard, right, if we pass element data in as a style for this H1, it would, like, so for instance, if we said something like style and we said color, blue, right? So this is CSS that is changing the color, right? We know that CSS, we could change things like the color, right? So this attribute is being applied to the H1, but what is actually going to get styled is the text that's wrapped inside. So to a degree, yes, the enclosed HTML can be manipulated by attributes passed on the wrapping container or on the wrapping element, let's say, right?
Okay.
This is one of the reasons why the div element is really cool, because you can use a div. So like, if you think about it, H1s wrap text HTML, right? But divs can wrap any HTML, right? So you can put any other HTML inside of there, right? Just even like it's showing us here. So that's just something worth noting. I'm actually glad that you asked that question. It's a very great question. So go ahead.
Oh, yeah, so I did have a follow-up. So I guess what I'm trying to say, actually, let me hold it till later, because it's kind of on the tip of my tongue and I'm not like certain how I want to word it. So, okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No problem, fam. No problem. So the next thing that we talked about, this is kind of where we got to with our HTML. The next thing we talked about was CSS, right? And so we started talking about, just like we got to here, every element in HTML can have styles associated with it. I see a couple folks raise their hands, so I'll get to y'all in a second. Every element in our body can be styled, right? And the way we can style it, there's actually multiple ways, but one way that we can style it, like we just saw, was passing the style prop or style attribute, excuse me, into the element, so that we can say, hey, the style will be blah, 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 right? Here we can pass things like we just saw, like color blue, right? This is one way to style elements in HTML. Secondly, we can also make use of a style element. So there's another element in HTML that's called a style element. And this element also is a place where we can write some CSS, kind of like we see here as an example, right? The style element is considered HTML, right? But it allows you to embed style into your document. So we could put the CSS inside of our document here, right? The thing that is interesting about this approach is that when you put styles into your document, you can imagine that the document itself would start to look a little interesting, right? It's not just now the structure, it has some style stuff in there and stuff. So personally speaking, I don't like to have my styles mixed in with my HTML, only because it just makes the document very hard to read, in my opinion. So what I like to do, and what is also considered a good practice in certain regards, a professional practice, is separating the different parts of that process, which is why the third way you see people styling is linking to a CSS file, right? So having an external file that represents your styling and linking that file into your document, such that your document now can take all the styles from that CSS file that you've described as a style sheet relationship to your document. So that's what we actually did here on line 16. We created a link to a CSS file with the relationship of a style sheet. Remember that the relationship attribute has a specific role to play in determining what types of linked files can be connected, right? So in this case, we have the style sheet relationship with the CSS file, and that CSS file now has all of the capabilities of influencing our styling in our HTML with the CSS syntax, which CSS syntax is, we have a selector, what we call a element selector, and that selector is essentially saying which elements in the HTML document will my specific rules apply to. And the rule in CSS is basically a value that you're trying to change, and then the property that you're trying to change, and then the value that you're giving it. So in this case, we're selecting H1 elements and saying, hey, for each H1 element that I find, I want to take the color property and give it blue. So this will turn our H1 elements blue. Similarly, we have this div here, and right, what we're doing was creating a bit of CSS that's saying for whatever div I see, I want to give it certain properties, like a height of 140 pixels, a width of 140 pixels, and then a specific border, right? So this is kind of how CSS allows for us to start to select elements inside of the HTML to style in a more cohesive way. So I saw that a couple folks had questions. So Mamadou, go ahead, and then Michael, you can go next.
Professor, I want to ask, like, in the head, where we have the link, the real one, yeah, the style sheet. This one is like, okay.
You're asking like, what is this?
Yes, the sit. This one is sit because we have the web page like a sheet, right? Or why we have the style sheet?
So their link element has there's different types of links you can create from your HTML to other resources, like it's saying here, right? So a couple other ones would be like a script, which is has a different relationship to your HTML than a style sheet does, or a icon does, right? So the relationship attribute is just specific to allowing your link to know what relationship does the corresponding URL have to the document, the HTML document that you're creating. So there's different relationships that you can have, and it can either be, a style sheet is one of them. We can have there's like, so style sheet is one of them. So is script, and so is icon. I'll just go back and we can see. Remember, like, one of the cool things about how VS Code works is that we can get quick access to the developer docs, right? And so the attributes, we looked at this a little bit last time, but there's a couple of different types of relationships that a URL might contain to our particular HTML. So here's just the big list of them, right? Some of these I didn't even know until just looking, but things like the icon, right? An icon representing a specific URL, right? We have seen the, if we keep scrolling, we got style sheet in there, right? And so these are different relationships that we can form with that connecting URL to our HTML document. And I'm sorry, I realize the script isn't actually, we don't use the link element to create scripts. There's a separate element that we use to create scripts. But yeah, Mamadou, basically, whenever you create a link to a document in HTML, you describe what the relationship is that document will have to that specific resource you're linking to. So for the most part, the one that you're going to use the most is style sheet because you're linking CSS. But it's just good to know that in certain cases you might have, you might see in other websites, different relationships. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Michael, go ahead.
Hey, I actually had my hand left up from before.
No problem.
I do remember my previous question, so I might as well ask it now that I have the podium or whatever. So, like, yeah, I guess so. you said before that like an enclosed element will inherit the style from an enclosing element, but we can always override that by using like an inline script, right? Or like a class or whatever, right?
Yeah, you can override any aspect of the styling that you give your elements. That's true.
All right, cool. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Okay, so let's just go ahead. So remember last session, I showed y'all how I like to deploy static websites so I can see them in a more real-time sense, which is by using the live server. So I'll just go ahead and start the live server, which should theoretically give me the opportunity to see the HTML and all those related files in a more functional way. So here we go. We see now, right, a little bit more of what is going on within that HTML that we were working with, right? So as you remember, we had a very simple flow of elements, right? We had the H1 that we turned blue with the CSS. We had a H2 in there, and then this is the little div that could, right? And it's going to help us build out our wonderful tic-tac-toe game board. So a lot of really interesting HTML to get just to this point where we're more able to see this particular bit of code doing what we expect it to do. So if y'all give me 1 second, my computer is bugging a little bit. Sorry. Okay, cool. So let's get back into what we want to do now. So essentially, we have the HTML for our code for our square showing up, and that was our big goal, was to go ahead and make it so that we could see this wonderful square, so that we could eventually build out our game board that would allow us to play tic-tac-toe. And so that's what we're going to continue on doing today, is getting to the point where we are able to see an actual game of tic-tac-toe get created. But in order to do that, right, the game board is probably one of the most important things for us to create first. So let's get back into our code and talk a little bit about how we're going to do this, right? So we have our first div created, and I think this is going to be a very amazing opportunity for us to talk a little bit more about the connecting elements of HTML and CSS, and some more things that you have to keep in mind while working with HTML and CSS in this regard. So right now we have our first little square showing up, and this is awesome in that this square is allowing for us to kind of visualize that first building block of our board, right? And so as you remember, a tic-tac-toe board is structured in a very specific way, right? Let's just look at a tic-tac-toe board. It's 9 squares, and the squares are kind of outlined in a big square, right? So something like this, right? So for us, we got to figure out how to go from just one square to this board-like structure for our squares. And so the idea is that what we're going to do is we're going to use some more divs to do this. And the cool thing is, because of the way that the CSS is working right now, right? What do you think is going to happen if I continue to add divs like this? Right? We need 9 divs. So what if I just do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 divs, right? Well, the unique thing is that by logic of the CSS, right, all those divs are going to get the style that we passed into it. Why is this doing this? Well, remember what I was saying about how CSS works. CSS works by selecting elements and essentially passing style to certain elements, right? So because our CSS right now is selecting all divs, it's basically saying, hey, for any div that I see, I want to make it so that that div has these properties, right? Which is helpful right now in the case that, hey, yeah, we do need 9 squares. That definitely is helpful. But what could this mean for us more long-term in our application? Well, let's take a look at these H1s and kind of, let me just demonstrate this point to you real quick, right? So right now we have this H1 for tic-tac-toe, right? And here we're saying, you know, it's X's turn with H2, but what if, like, you know, somewhere else I have, you know, maybe at the bottom of all these divs, I have another H1 and I'm just saying, great job, or something, right? Some random H1 that we have at the bottom here, right? Well, what if, for instance, this is just an example. What if I don't want this H1 to be blue, right? Well, right now, it's kind of tough for the code to know, hey, I only want this H1 to be blue and not the other one, right? So the reality is that styling all the elements might not be in your best interest in certain moments in time, right? This topic is something that you can generalize, right? It doesn't just have to be H1s or whatever, but maybe you create elements that have, you want one element to have a certain thing, but you don't want the other ones to have a certain thing, right? But if you style with CSS in a way where you only style based on the element, you will apply those styles to all of the elements that correspond with this selector. So CSS selectors are a very important topic to understand because they are the building block for how your styling will be applied to your site. I love going to the W3 schools again because it's just such a great resource for learning about these things in the web, right? So in the CSS tutorial for the W3 schools, they actually show us a little bit more of the different types of selectors that we can use, right? So here are a big list of different selectors that are possible in CSS. So remember, these selectors relate to elements that will be selected, right? So here, like we see, there is a selector that we use to just choose an element, right? An element would be like, hey, I want all of the paragraph elements to be styled the same. That's kind of like what we have now. But you see that there's some other, what we call simple selectors, elements, selectors that will select different types of elements based on how you structure your CSS. Another one outside of the name of the element are ID and class. And we're going to actually talk about these two right now because they're going to be helpful, not only for our project, but whenever you're working in specific other projects with CSS. But beyond the simple selectors, just wanted you to know before we dive into those, that there's other types of selectors that are even more sophisticated. Combinator selectors, which select elements based on a relationship between those elements, or pseudo class selectors, select elements based on certain moments in time and state on the website. Pseudo element selectors, which style part of elements. Attribute selectors, where you can style elements based on the attributes that those elements contain. It gets very deep with CSS. And like I was telling you last session, learning CSS and design and all of the styling that goes into web development is in and of itself its own profession and its own challenge, I should say. It's a challenging thing, but it also is very respectable thing to learn because it's something that is very important, as you can imagine, for making web pages that function the way that we would expect them to. But right now we're going to dive more into these simple selectors. So the first simple selector is the one we know, the name selector, which takes a specific element name and finds all the elements with that particular name, right? So again, just to make just so there's example, right? So every paragraph, because we have this styling with for every paragraph, any paragraph element in our HTML will be styled with those same CSS rules. So beyond the element selector, we have two other selectors that are very important to know. The first one is the ID selector, which allows for you to target a specific HTML element and give it its own styling. The ID selector is one of the most important attributes in HTML because of the fact that we can use IDs to specifically identify an element of our choosing. So let's go back to our example here, and I'll show you how using the ID element, the ID attribute can help us, right? So remember this example I was giving where I was like, oh, you know, what if we have two H1s and I don't want the second H1 to be styled the same as the first H1, right? Well, this is a great opportunity to make use of the ID attribute, where the ID attribute is essentially allowing us to say, right, hey, what is a unique ID for this element that I want to give it? So maybe I want to give this, you know, maybe I want to say this is our main message or something, right? Something like this. The thing is that I can name this ID anything I want, but the idea is that this ID will be given to this specific element, which is great for a number of reasons that we'll find out more of as we continue to dive into the site and complexities of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But one of the amazing things that using this ID attribute is it will allow for us to then style the CSS a little bit more effectively. So as you can see from the blurb that pops up, right, it defines a unique identifier which must be unique in the whole document, meaning that only each ID corresponds to one element, and its purpose is to identify the element and allow for you to use it for different purposes in JavaScript or specifically in our case for CSS. So now that we have, I should save this, now that we have this H1 with a specific ID, right, we can also create CSS that's going to apply to the specific H1 or to the specific element, I should say, with that ID, right? Because in any element can have an ID, but the ID is unique to whatever element has it, if that makes sense. So for this, if I want to style the ID, if I want the CSS to say, hey, find the element with that ID, I use the pound, hashtag, whatever y'all call this, drawn right here, number sign. This is the syntax for defining out a ID. So our ID was called main message, right? And so here I can give that, here I can give a specific styling to any element that contains the ID, right? Main message. So this means that here I could say, hey, you know, I want to give this a different color. Maybe I'll give it red as a color. And by doing this, I will now be able to have a different style associated with this particular H1 as opposed to this one, right? So this gets at two very important things. One is what we just talked about. IDs are really cool because they allow us to differentiate elements from each other. The second thing is that CSS is very interesting in how the rules of CSS get applied. Actually, this is why CSS is called CSS, or cascading style sheet, which is the name, which is what the CSS really means. Cascading style sheets will follow the last thing first, basically. So each time, every time the CSS kind of reads from top to bottom. So first, if you can imagine, what goes on is the HTML sees this H1 element, this H1 styling, and says, hey, you know, H1 should be blue. But then the literal next one is, hey, you know, H1 should be, this particular H1 should be red, right? So this CSS will overwrite the previous CSS that would have applied to both of those H1s. So this is really interesting because CSS follows rules of prioritization. And this is also a pretty interesting but equally as complex conversation, which is how does CSS do its prioritization. Some of it goes into, like, you know, where was the CSS declared, right? So if I had like another H1 here and I save this, right? Clearly now all of these H1s are going to be red, right? Because the last style applied to H1s is this one versus this one. So this is kind of a simple example of, oh, you know, if I have one CSS applying before another one or after another one, the last one will win. But also when it comes to things like IDs and how those elements get prioritized, you can see some more of the prioritization schema in when you hover over these things in like VS Code, this thing about selector specificity. So again, like I told you, this is a pretty, this is an important topic because it will impact how your CSS is applied, but it also is a pretty sophisticated topic. So not something that, you know, you got to dive into immediately, but something worth knowing when it comes to why might my styles not being applied in the way that I expect. Some of it goes into selector specificity. And as we can see, this selector specificity for the ID has a specificity of 1 before the 0, 0, which, like I said, kind of gets into some topics we might talk about in a little bit. But if we look at the H1, right, the specificity is different. So the different specificities will determine which CSS gets applied in which moments. And so that's just something worth knowing. But the biggest takeaway I want you to take away from this is just the fact that we can use IDs in this really interesting way to demarcate specific elements from other elements in our CSS for the purpose of styling those things differently. So if you understand what I'm talking about with the ID and why it's valuable, just drop a thumbs up on the chat or in just on the Zoom real quick. I would appreciate that as I sip this cold iced tea. Shout out my sponsor, Iced Tea. Dope. Seeing a lot of thumbs. Appreciate that. All right. So let's do this actually how we are going to have it, right? So we're not actually going to have this random H1 at the bottom, but we will probably want to create some more specific CSS for ourselves later. I could keep this one here for now because, you know, it's not really harming us. I don't really want this to be red, so let me just get rid of that little bit of styling here. And matter of fact, since I'm not really styling anything, I'm just gonna get rid of these for now. And yeah, just save this and save this. And so, yeah, it hurts nothing for us to have an ID applied to a style, even if we're not styling it. So I'll keep it for now, just since it's not hurting, but to keep y'all thinking about it. So that was IDs, right? The next, and also equally as important, but also somewhat related to the ID selector, is the class selector. The class selector functions just like the ID selector, meaning we can give elements in HTML the class attribute, and we can style those elements with the specific class attribute selected, right? The difference between the ID selector and the class selector is that the class selector can apply to multiple elements versus the ID selector, which only applies to one. So IDs are unique. No matter what, if you give an element an ID, it is tied to only that element, right? Class selectors are used when you want to give multiple elements a identifier that they can use to represent themselves. So the class selector allows for us to select a group of elements that have the same class versus the ID, which will only find one, right? So whereas, so IDs, right, we said main message, and the main message was kind of styled like this, right? This is for ID. So the class selector would be something like styled like this. So let's just say I have a class called square, and the square, right, if we hover over this, right, is applying to any element with the attribute square. But the literal difference is that classes can be on multiple elements. So based on how our tic-tac-toe board is going to be structured, which of those attributes do you think I would want to use for all of these divs, to style all of these divs in our board, right? Because it doesn't make sense for me to just keep it as div, because what if I have another div? What if I have a div wrapping our message, right? Our messages or something, right? I don't want this div to be styled the same way, right? So I might want to change my CSS, right? Because if I keep this div styled the same way as all these divs, let's see what will happen here. So if I wrap our messages in a div and I save this, right? Oh, well, that is not what tic-tac-toe is supposed to look like, right? So I might not want this first div to have any of that styling. I might want only the divs for the board to be styled that way, right? So based on what we just talked about, which selector would be best to use, ID or class? I'm seeing some folks drop it in the chat. Appreciate y'all. Yep. Definitely want to use the class selector, and the class selector because we can apply a style consistent across all of those divs versus just one, right? If I use the ID, it would only apply to one. Whereas in this case, because I have multiple divs, it might be cool for me to give each div a class name that all of them can have. So rather than have 9 just blank divs, right? I can just create 9 that have the 3, 6, I'm good. That have the square, right? And so by doing this, right? So remember in my styling at first, I was targeting all divs. So now if I save this and get rid of this square on top of this in this div, right? We can see our thing is going to go back to oh, my bad. I didn't actually change the style. I was like, what? What happened? I started freaking out. But so instead of styling all the divs, right, I will want this style applied to just the class for the square, right? And so now any element with the class name square is going to have these attributes tied to them, right? So cool. Now that I did that, we're back to where we want to be, where we got our text outside of our little game board, and everything is as everything should be. And these styles are consistent across all 9 squares. So if I do something like add a different style, like let's say I want to give all of these divs a different color, like, well, to style the color of a div, actually, I got to use the background color CSS. So if I want to, let's say I want to give this div, all these divs like pink, right? All the divs will be styled at the same time because they're all corresponding with that class selector that's being selected. Cool. Give me a thumbs up if you're rocking with me. You understand what I'm saying? Difference between the ID attribute and the class attribute. If you got it, give me a thumbs up. I love it. Love to see it. I am, Mamadou, go ahead. You have a question or you just shout me out?
Sorry, I mix up the time.
No problem. Appreciate you. So cool. So dope. So I don't really want a hot pink tic-tac-toe board. that's just there for dramatic effect. We got our main message in here. We're gonna style that maybe later, but these are the 2 important things to talk about are the ID and the class selector, which clearly we have here. So now that we have this all going on, right? This is a good starting point for right? We have our 9 squares, but as you can see, the squares aren't really doing, they're not doing what we would hope that they would do, right? So what we would really want is that all of these squares would kind of show up as a tic-tac-toe board, right? More organized in this regard. So how do you go about, now that you have elements on the page, how do you go about structuring them in a positioning way? So this is also a pretty important topic that comes up all the time, especially in more advanced websites, right? And the reality is that positioning things in HTML and CSS requires you to know a bit more about how HTML elements are structured, right? So in HTML, we can create elements that either are, we can either create elements that are called inline elements or block elements. And so the difference between a block element and an inline element are that block elements always start in a different line than elements that are inline, which kind of go into the same, they keep taking up the same amount of space, right? And so HTML elements, different elements have these different properties to them based on the ways that those elements are already kind of defined, right? So divs are block elements. So as you can see from our board, right, every div is starting on its own line, right? This is different than like a span, right, which is a different element that puts everything in the same line. So first off, it's important to know some of the different block level elements versus the inline elements, right? We're using all the elements we're using right now are block level, right? The headings and the div that we're using, etc., right? All those elements are allowing for our page to do this kind of everything going down process. That's why everything's kind of vertically going like how it's going. Just to kind of show you the difference between this and like inline elements, let me just kind of create a couple at the top here. So underneath this H2, I'm just going to create a span, and I'm going to put some text in the span and say, so a span is another element that it also like a div. It just is kind of used when you want to it's kind of just useful for when you're trying to style things inside of the span. So again, the span, just like a div, kind of wraps HTML. For this case, I'm just going to put like just some text, right? So we have one span there, and then if I put another span and I say, let's just do some lines or something, right? So the thing about spans is, as you can see, both of those spans are appearing on the same line, right? So this is the difference between inline elements versus block elements. Block elements always will start on a new line, whereas inline elements will start on the same line. And so it's important to know what type of element are you using, because sometimes when you're displaying elements, you might want them to display with a specific property that allows for them to show up the way that you would expect them to on your page. The first thing is to start there. It's just knowing that different elements have different elements contain different types of work differently on how they show up on the page. I'm trying to find a good way to say it. So the reality is, for us to style this these elements that are now block elements kind of moving vertically will require us to do some work within the positioning of those elements. And basically the topic that we got to cover really quickly is the I don't think got it in here. Okay, they do got it in here. So one of the things we got to talk about in order to understand like positioning and laying out elements is Flexbox. So CSS Flexbox is one of those types of topics that always gets people a little bit confused in the beginning. But think about it like Flexbox is about how are you going to structure elements inside of a container, right? So this is kind of like what we want to do, which is, hey, we want to have one container that has all of our boxes contained inside of it, right? So when we have that scenario where it's like, hey, you know, I don't just want all 9 of these things. I can get rid of these. I could get rid of these spans real quick. But right, we have this scenario where we want to make these 9 squares kind of function within a container or function within like this box of sorts, right? So in order to do that, that's a good use case for using something like Flexbox, right? Of course, there's other ways for us to individually take each object and give it its own style and its own positioning and things of that nature. And that is also important to know when it comes to HTML and CSS, is that you can align and move things based on certain CSS properties, like alignment, horizontally and vertically aligning elements. There's CSS that allows for us to do this. These types of things are good for when we want to like move and center things, right? So sometimes you need to do things like this. Other times we want to more specifically change the position of elements, and that there's CSS that we can use to do that, which changes like based on where elements are positioned. You can very clearly give them more different ways of positioning themselves, for lack of better words, right? So layouts, positioning, and all of these things, as I'm trying to get you to see, is a topic in CSS that revolves around what is it that you're trying to do. And there's a lot of different CSS that you can use when you're getting to the point of saying, hey, how might I move elements to be styled very differently? And this goes back to like what we were talking about before with the demo of this like multiple CSS page thing, where as you can see, all of this HTML is here, but each of these style sheets kind of has these things in a different place, like organized in a very interesting way. Some of what does that is things like those elements, those CSS rules that we are just talking about, like positioning and laying out stuff, and even adding some of the flexbox concepts to certain divs and certain elements on the page. So for us, we're going to talk a little bit more about flexbox because that's what we need to use in order to get this working the way that we want it to. So the thing that you need to understand about flexbox is that it works in the case where you have elements in a container and you want to structure how are those elements laid out in a container, right? So right now, all of these divs are kind of loose, right? They're just kind of floating in the sense that there's no overarching container of them. You might be like, well, what about the body element? Which is like, yes, the body is containing all of these divs in that sense, like it's wrapping all of those elements. But typically we don't want to style, we don't want to put all of our styling on the body because that's going to impact all of the elements inside of the body, right? So rather than do that, what we might want to do is, hey, well, we know an element that we can use to be a container. What if we use that as the container for all of these other containers? So if you said that, I'd be like, you're a genius. That's a great idea. So let's just do that. So first, I'm just going to make a new div that's going to be a container, move all of these elements up into that div, and boom. Now we have all of our squares are inside of a bigger container, which is just this div that we have here. This div that we have now, right? We can put some styling on this that will say, hey, this div is our container, and that container is going to do certain things to all of the elements inside of it, right? So because I want this div to be more specifically named or just specifically targeted, I'm going to give this div an attribute to mark it as something that I want to target specifically, right? So the first thing I want to do is I'm just going to give this div a, let me think, how should I do it? I'm going to give this div so we can talk about more of what it does with the flexbox. I'm just going to give this div an ID, and I'm going to say flex container. And this is just like I said, the ID is just meant for us to be able to more specifically say, hey, which div are we talking about? And I'm like, hey, we're talking about this one. That's the container for all of these other squares. So first thing I want to do is first I'll save this. And now we can, because this div has this ID, I can go ahead and start styling it a lot more in the CSS. So instead of the main message, since we're not using this yet, I'm just going to go ahead and start putting some CSS together inside of here, right? So remember, for IDs, I want to use the pound sign, this operator, to target that element specifically. So let's see some of these different element changes that happen as we start to use some of the flexbox properties on the div container that's containing all of our squares, right? So in order to make a container or make a wrapping div a container for flex or like flexbox, you have to give that container that particular display. So display is a CSS property. Let's go to the display. Do they have it here? They should, right? Display is a property in CSS that talks about how an element is displayed. So remember, I told you that there's different default display types, the block and inline, right? So when something is displayed block, it will take up its it will always start on the next line, right? Inline will always display on the same line as other elements. But we can display, there's other properties that we can use with display. And one of them is none, which just turns off the types of display that you can see. This is how you can hide elements on your HTML pages, is if you give a CSS that says something like display none. Very common to see where, you know, in certain cases where you might hide things using display none. But do they have it? Do they even have it in here? They don't even have it in here. But another property for display is flex, which allows for us to display an element that in a context of using flex. So basically, to use Flexbox, I need to first tell the container that it is going to display itself with flex, meaning that container is going to display things in that flexible way that will allow for us to change more about how the enclosed items are related to each other. So first thing I'm going to do is just add this display flex to our, oh, my bad. First thing I'm going to do is change this display flex to this particular, to this attribute or to this CSS, but I had given it the wrong name. I think we called it flex container. So cool. So by giving it the display flex, right? Now, all of those squares are now being changed to be fit into one line, right? So this is pretty interesting. If we take a look at the element inspector on the browser, right? You can see that it will highlight this. So we can see that the flex container is enclosing all of our squares, and then each square is still represented by its own, in its own element. But if you look very closely, like at these first ones, right? So clearly one square is overlapping the other square. So it's not actually showing all of the squares, which is why it kind of looks like these squares got messed up. But you can see clearly from looking at these elements in the inspector that it does still have a square height and width, but the way that this is showing up is preventing us from seeing it as actual squares. So that's something worth knowing and being able to change a bit, right? So flex clearly is going to change how the items inside of the flex container are going to relate to one another. And yeah, there's a lot of different things that we can change about how these items are being displayed, for lack of better words. So cool. So we got a first bit of like, okay, we have this container. What do we got to do now? Well, what we want to do now is we actually want this container not to just show all of the elements just kind of side by side like this. We'd want it to do kind of like 3 by 3 by 3. So one thing to say at this point is there's multiple ways to do kind of some of these things in HTML and CSS. By no means am I suggesting this is the only way to do it, right? Some people might be like, well, why don't you use like a CSS grid, right? Or the grid layout system. That's a great idea for how you might also create a board using some HTML and CSS. And it just goes to show like you can use CSS creatively almost to get at what you want to get at in a way that works for you. So there's different ways to style HTML, I should say. But for the purposes of now, I'm just going to keep going and hacking on this and adding some CSS here that will allow for us to basically get at seeing our, getting our board together, right? So first thing I did, I wanted to get this container wrapping all of the elements. So as you can see, it starts changing what those elements are doing, right? The next thing I want to do is I want to make it so that this big box, for lack of better words, is first thing is like, if you can see real quick, Zoom has a lot of stuff on my thing that I can't see. So let's just do this. So if you can see real quick, right, the entire, this entire container, right, is taking up our space on the site. So let me go back to this. So here, right, if I were to, let's see, if I were to like move our site, right? So you can see like the container is taking up our, is going up to the size of our page, right? So our browser, which is also very interesting. So it goes into this, this is going into some of the things that happen with styling, right? Where changing the width of your browser can impact how things are going to get styled. But in this case, the flex, when we add flex to a container, the first thing it does is it starts taking up the entire width of the container, which is why all of these squares, one, are stacked up all the way horizontally. And then we now want it to make it so that not only does this take up this particular we don't necessarily want it to take up this whole width, right? What we really want it to do is just kind of allow for us to see 3 boxes at a time, right? So that's the first thing I want to change is I kind of want to make it so that this these boxes show up in the way that I would hope with the 3x3x3, which is kind of just default tic-tac-toe. That's kind of how the board is structured. So we're gonna want to add a couple more properties to this to get it to do that. So first thing I want to do is pull back up the code. And so what I want to do now is I want to make it so that this container also wraps in a way, right? And creates that kind of wrap. So I know that y'all are like, oh, I'm learning some CSS here. So I'm just going to show y'all some CSS that we can use to do this. So one thing, if you want in your containers for elements to wrap like this, you can add a property into your Flexbox containers to do that. So there's a flex wrap property that allows for us to wrap elements inside of it. So flex wrap basically just tells us whether the container is single line or multi-line, right? Multi-line would be us like having it kind of wrap over a couple lines, right? And it will just kind of determine that type of box that shows up for that container. So first things first, I'm just going to add that property. And as you can see, we're already kind of doing a little bit of wrapping, which by default, what it did was it looked at the width of all of these elements. And as you can see, at a certain point, the width of all of our squares full out was more than what the browser was. So it wrapped the ones that didn't fit, if that makes sense. So that's why these 3 are on their own line, right? So that gets at the height and width part of our squares, are determining how is this going to wrap in the actual browser. So if I go back here, right? So clearly the can't really see everything. Oops. I actually don't need this part right now. So clearly, right, this container takes up this in both of these lines. And because now that we added that flex wrap, we can see it's doing this multi-line thing, which is allowing us to preserve the width and height of all those squares, which is dope. So flex wrap is great. That did one of the things I really wanted it to do. But now what I want it to do is I want to give this container a more specific width that will allow for that wrap to go onto the third line, right? And so essentially, I just need to choose a width that basically makes it so only 3 squares will show up, right? So I'm going to just do something like, let's say I'm going to do anything really over 420 would cover this, right? So what I'm going to do, right, because each square is 140, so if 140 times 3, right? But I'll leave a couple bit of room for things like padding or other things I might add later. So let's just say 432 pixels, just kind of random number that I had already created. So this is just going to give us that little 3x3x3, which is kind of what we wanted in the long run, right? I think there was a reason I didn't do 420. Let me see. Oh yeah, it has to be a little, let's see, 420 with like 430, right? So it turned out that like I needed to kind of get at least up to 432 to do that. So this is just interesting. I gotta look back into why that was the case. I think it was because of the border, to be honest. Yeah, I think it's because of the border. Yeah, we got our 3x3x3, which is great. Now's a good time for me to actually go back to some stuff that I told y'all before, which is cool. Now that I have this working as I would expect it, I am the type of person, I love to save my work as I'm doing it. So first thing I'm going to do is just kind of get back into the Git flow. So Git status was just going to help me take a look at what files did I update since the last time I was working. So I've clearly updated the CSS a bunch, and we've updated the HTML also, and added a couple elements. So now I want to just add all of those changes. And now that I've added those changes, if I do another Git status, it'll tell me, hey, all those changes are ready to be saved. And so I will now just kind of do a Git commit to commit these changes. And I'll say, creating, or let's say using Flexbox for our board, right? Cool. So now I have all these different commits for the project as it kind of currently stands. I don't know where they just went. That's my bad. But here's all of our different commits from the beginning till now, right? So that's dope. Really helpful. Cool. So now I have all of those. I have the board kind of structured the way that I want it. And this is definitely really helpful. Some of what I might want to do now is like just change a little bit more about how all of this is kind of working in a bigger picture sense. And so the so I might want to get us to a point, right, where now, right, we have our game board kind of showing up. And if we look at the kind of code that got us there, we have this div container that's enclosing all of these other squares, which is dope. But as you can see, the flex container for the div is doing a lot. And so in certain regards, it's just sometimes important just to know that if you intend to use certain styles across your page in different regards, you might then decide how you want to structure the CSS, because I can also break out that CSS into other into other rules for other purposes. So for instance, if I want to make it so that our entire board is kind of doing a little bit better job of kind of centering itself, one thing that I might want to do is, like we talked about, right? If I add another div here, and this div kind of wraps not only our container, but kind of this bigger, wraps our whole container, right? This div I might want this div to kind of allow for us to position this big box, like this big box of all 9 of our squares, right, in a more particular way for our board or whatnot, right? So the thing is, the flex container has a couple properties that I might want to use again, right? Like the display flex, for instance. So instead of, oh, maybe I just give this a whole nother class, right? It might be helpful for me to do something like, oh, well, maybe instead of just having this as an ID, so there's only one container, I might say like, hey, maybe I want this to also be a container to do flex for the elements inside of it. And if I try to give this an ID, this doesn't actually work, right? I can't actually give these 2 elements an ID. So the solution here would be for me to just make this a class real quick. And by doing this, I will be able to share those elements, the flex part at least, with both of those divs. And so by doing this, now I might want to actually give another class for the flex wrap to do the wrapping part, right? And just keep that kind of separate. And in doing this, now I can use the properties of the flex container and the flex wrap, but each div container can kind of do it separately. So in this case, what I wanted to really do is I want to make it so that we are able to kind of hold all of our divs in one container, which is this one, right? But I want another container to wrap that entire container, because what if I add something else later underneath our board or stuff? And so clearly what's missing here is, hey, this div still needs that flex container. So this also goes to show a really another important thing about HTML and CSS, which is that HTML elements can have multiple class names attached to them. So here, I still want to give this class a flex container, because this div for our board is still in need of the div for our board is still in need of that container. But right now, whoops, what am I thinking? Oh, I didn't save this. I was just tweaking here. So this div for the container, right? Both of these need to be contained. So I'll show you what I was trying to do here right now. So here we have our div for our board, right? And we already saw this. We had a container and we were wrapping to make it so that it wrapped the way we wanted. But now we have this other container, right? That's wrapping the entire board. Because of the flex, remember what I said with the flex is now it'll take up the whole width, which now, because I have this other div, I could do something like reposition this entire board, because I can now make certain decisions on that container, right? So that was kind of what I wanted to achieve, just so that I can center this board a little better. I don't like how it's kind of riding up on the left-hand side. So what I'm gonna do is inside of the CSS for the container, right? I'll say, hey, anything that's a container will display flex clearly, because that's what we want it to do, is to, you know, flexibly move all of the elements inside of it. But now I'll use some of those other positioning things to justify things in the center of the board. So the two properties that you can use to center elements are justify content and align items, which justifies and aligns based on the height and the vertical and the horizontal axis. So now I kind of have the board more in the center, which is cool, because that kind of is a better looking board. But now I have this text at the top that also should be centered too, right? So to do that, I can think about creatively, how might I do this, right? So I have another div already kind of wrapping that text, right? So what would happen if, let's just take a look, if I say class equals flex container up here. And boom. Oh, well, almost there, right? CSS is like that, right? Where it's like, oh, well, that was almost there, but by now adding the flex container, as you can see, it just put everything horizontal, all on one line, even though these are two block elements. Because now I gave this container on top of them flex, these elements are being displayed with flex as well, which overwrites that block level nature to them, meaning now they're kind of side by side. There's a couple things I could do to fix this. I could just get rid of the flex container here, but this is a great opportunity to show a different property that I might want to use that allows for me to, that will allow for me to kind of style this differently. So instead of, because I wasn't really using this ID main message at all, I'm gonna actually put an ID up here, and I'm just gonna say game messages or something, right? And so we'll have our game title and we'll have our little kind of game message here, right? So if I have now this ID, right, saving this isn't going to do anything because nothing really has changed. So they're still kind of side by side. But what I could do is say, hey, now whenever I want to, what I want to do maybe is to change that game messages ID, and that ID is going to target the element with that particular unique identifier. So it won't anything I put here will only target this div versus all these other div containers that I created underneath. So maybe what I'll do here is just kind of do something like to just show y'all that there's different ways that you can work with the flex box. So by default, the flex box will bring elements onto the same row. So the default for Flexbox properties is all the elements will be in a direction on the same row. But what I might want to do is have them kind of vertically align themselves. And so to do that, one thing I can do is change the flex direction to be column, which basically that will turn everything back to vertical. So now we have our thing is centered. We have our game board and we have our messages kind of there as well, with our little board here, and cool. Kind of at a decent place there. So I'm going to also just kind of go ahead to just do another git commit. As you can see, git commits with the styling can be really helpful, because as your page starts to get more complex, being able to go back to old versions that you have of your site before all of those styles could be really helpful. So again, just to repeat the process, clearly I've added some new files that I haven't changed, that I've changed. First thing I want to do is just add them, git commit, and then I'm going to say centering game board using flex. Cool. And now I have all of these things saved in a great way. And cool, we're actually at a great point with our board to now play tic-tac-toe, right? So, I'm clicking, but nothing's going on, right? Well, this actually is really an interesting point, right? HTML and CSS can only take us so far with something like this, right? HTML allowed for us to get at the overarching structure of our site, right? We have everything we need to play tic-tac-toe is here. We have our board, we have our 9 squares, right? We have it all displayed the right way. And CSS helped us get to the point where it was displayed the right way, where we started putting some properties like flex into motion and really making our board that much better of a game board, right? And of course, now the question is, well, how do we actually get to the point of playing tic-tac-toe? If you're curious about that, give me a thumbs up, because you're like, oh, now that we got here, how are we gonna get to the game, the actual game part? I want to play the game, right? Like, yeah, that's the logical next step. That's the logical question, and that's exactly where we want to go. So we know if in order to create these web experiences, a lot goes into it. The HTML is literally its own task. Take some time to think about what are the elements I'm going to need to build this up. The CSS can equally take its own time, because, you know, what's funny is all the CSS, like I told you, I did in a particular way, just as an example, and, you know, struggled a little bit because I was going off script some, but I just wanted you to see that there's different ways to style things. And at the end of the day, styling can take a life of its own because of the fact that there's so many ways to style stuff. So I'm sure for some folks who might have seen CSS, or even yourself from things you've read, you might be like, oh, maybe there's another way to do it. I highly encourage you to play around, right? The cool thing about the web is there's certain things that are great to do, professional things to do that you'll read about. But at the same time, if your CSS accomplishes the task, we'll know because we're going to see it, right? So that's one of the things I love about the web, is it's kind of open-ended to the degree that whatever you can get working can work in that regard, for sure, which is amazing about that. And design is subjective too, right? Some people would be like, I actually liked it, left justified, right? But the part that we are really the part we really care about, I don't know why that tripped me up real quick. The part we really care about is figuring out how we're going to play this game. And in order to do that, we're going to need some JavaScript. That's the short answer of this. And this is where HTML, CSS stop and JavaScript kind of turns in and takes the stage. So what we're going to do in our next session, in the last one, is just really get at the JavaScript that goes behind the scenes here to get our board working. And the reality is that the JavaScript is pretty, there's part of it that's complicated, which is really just the logic of how do I know when somebody wins tic-tac-toe? But the part that really is fascinating and will be interesting to take a look into is how we can use the JavaScript to manipulate the HTML and CSS that we have here so that we can actually play the game as we would expect. The JavaScript has built-in APIs that allow for us to connect to our HTML document and manipulate elements. It's called the JavaScript DOM. And we're going to use the functions that come from the JavaScript DOM in order to do things like manipulate the HTML, change things about the HTML, find elements, all of those wonderful things. And so there's a lot more to come, and we're going to get this tic-tac-toe game popping, but I appreciate y'all